Chagiga Daf Yud Ches is divided in half by a Mishnah. First half of the daf is on the topic of the tashlumin that you're allowed to fill in a carbon chagiga that you missed on Shavuos. The Gemara will talk briefly about that and then go into the source that it is forbidden to do malacha on Chol HaMoed. The Gemara will give 5 sources for that. Then the Mishnah will take us into a totally new subject, and that is Tumma and Tahara, which will take us till the end of the Masechta, the next 10 blot. So let's begin. The Gemara has been discussing the fact that there is an obligation to bring a carbon chagiga on a Yom Tov, and if you didn't, you can fill it in on the days that follow. So for Sukkot and Pesach, you can fill it in on the rest of the Yom Tov. The question is, what do you do on Shavuos? The Gemara has said that you have 6 additional days to bring a carbon chagiga for a total of 7 altogether, just like Sukkot and Pesach. The Gemara has been looking for sources for that. So now the Gemara quotes a source that Reish Lakish brings that Rav Yochanan disagrees with. So this source is as follows. It says Chag HaKatzir. The Torah calls Shavuos Chag HaKatzir, the holiday of harvesting. So the Gemara asks, how could you harvest on Yom Tov? You're not allowed to do that. It must be referring to the time after the Yom Tov. It's referring to the days that follow the Yom Tov. And it's teaching us, therefore, that there is a time in which we can do tashlumin for the carbon chagiga. So the Gemara says that Rav Yochanan doesn't like that limud. He says that's not correct. That's not the right understanding of Chag HaKatzir. It doesn't mean that there is a Chag which you're allowed to do Katzir. It doesn't mean that part of Shavuos, which is still Chag in the sense that you're allowed to bring a carbon chagiga, is not Chag in the fact that you're allowed to do Katzir. That's not what it means. All that it means is that the Yom Tov of Shavuos is in the harvest season. That's all it means. And he says, I'll prove it to you. Because Sukkot is called Chag HaAsif, the season of the gathering. Now, what gathering you're allowed to do on Sukkot? You're not allowed to gather on Sukkot. It's a malacha. So you're not allowed to gather on the first day of Sukkot. You're not allowed to gather on the last day of Sukkot. And even Chol HaMoed you're not allowed to gather. So obviously, it means to tell me that it's the season of the gathering, the time when the crop harvest is ready to be is in the field, is bound, and is ready to be brought in. And you can't tell me that it's coming to say that you're allowed to do some carbon chagiga after Sukkot is over and after Shemini Atzeret is over, because that's not true. We know that halacha is false. So therefore, since Chag HaAsif just means that it's the gathering season, Chag HaKatzir just means that it's the harvesting season. So now the Gemara says, if you see from Rav Yochanan that it is us to do malach on Chol HaMoed, you also see that Reish Lakish agrees to that, because he does not respond to Rav Yochanan and say, no, you're allowed to gather on Chol HaMoed, and that's what Chag HaAsif is referring to. So both of them agree you're not allowed to do malach on Chol HaMoed. What is the source for that? The Gemara is going to bring 5 Tanaim bringing sources for that from a collection of 3 brises. So the first is as follows. It says, "It's Chag HaMatzos Tishmar Shivas Yomim." You should guard the holiday of Matzos, that is Pesach, for 7 days. Now the word guard indicates that you should not do something. You should not do malacha, and it says all 7 days. 7 days long, you're not allowed to do malacha, and therefore there's an Isser malacha even on Chol HaMoed. That's the Tanakama in the first brisa, and that which is Rav Yeshaya. And the Gemara says that Rav Yonason disagrees, and he says you could just learn it out of a Kal V'chomer from the first day and the second day. If the first day and the 7th day, if the first day and the last day of Sukkot and Pesach are usher to do malacha, the middle days are for sure usher, because they are sandwiched between 2 days that are Yom Tov. So if the days themselves, the first day and the last day of each, are not sandwiched between Yemei Kodesh, and it's usher to do malacha on those days, certainly the middle days, which are sandwiched between Yom Tov, they themselves are usher to do malacha. So the Gemara says, what kind of proof is that? The weekdays of any week, the 6 days of the week, are permitted to do malacha, and they're sandwiched between Shabbosim. So obviously being sandwiched between things doesn't help anything. The Gemara says, no, being sandwiched between it does help. The reason the 6 days of the week don't have any Isser malachas is because it's not a Yom Tov. There's nothing special about those days, as you can see from the fact that there's no carbon musaf on those days. So the Gemara says the carbon musaf doesn't make you Aser to do malacha. Rosh Chodesh has a carbon musaf, and Rosh Chodesh has no Isser malacha. So what does carbon musaf have to do with it? So Gemara answers, Rosh Chodesh is different. Rosh Chodesh should have an Isser malacha because of its carbon musaf. And the reason it doesn't is because the Torah doesn't call it Mikra Kodesh. Mikra Kodesh, it says about Chol HaMoed and about Yom Tov. It doesn't say about Rosh Chodesh. So Gemara says, once you have a source of Mikra Kodesh, that's enough of a reason for me to learn Isser Malacha from that. Mikra Kodesh, it's called holy, therefore there's an Isser Malacha even in Chol HaMoed. Okay, that's all the Gemara's first brisa. Now the Gemara goes to the second brisa, which has another two sources. So the Tanakama in this brisa is Rav Yossi Aglili, and he says it's learned out from the fact that it says Kol Malachas Avoda Lo Sasu, and then afterwards it says Shivas Yamim Tochal Matzos. So you read it as Kol Malachas Avoda Lo Sasu, Shivas Yamim, don't do any work for the entire 7 days. Therefore, Chol Hamoed is included in the 7 days, and it's usher to do work. Now, Rabbi Kiva is a different source. That's because it says Elu Meyad Hashem Mikra Kodesh. Tikrois Meyadim is these are the Yom Tov of Hashem, and they're all Mikra Kodesh, and that it teaches me that they're usher to do work. Now, what days are usher? Doesn't say. It just says Moyad Hashem are Mikra Kodesh. Now, it can't be referring to the first day and the last day of either Yom Tov, because there it already says Shabboson. It says Yom Harishon Shabboson, Yom Hashvi Shabboson. So it's got to be referring to the middle days of Chol Hamoed, and it's telling you that it's also to work on those days. Now, the Gemara's fifth source comes from a brisa that contains just one opinion, and that's where it says Sheishes Yamim Tochal Matzos of Yom Hashvi Atzeres LaHashem. 6 days you should eat matzos, and the 7th day is an atzeres. Now, atzeres we read as the word atzor, which means to stop. You should stop from doing work on the 7th day. And we have a link here between the Shishes Yamim that you eat matzos and the 7th day. So Shishes Yamim Teichel Matzos Uva Yom Hashvi Atzeres. So therefore, just like there's an Isam Lacha on the 7th day, there's an Isam Lacha all 6 days. Now, you may think that it's the same level of Malacha. Therefore, it says that Shvi is Atzeres. Shvi has a greater stoppage. So, Shvi, it says, Atzor, don't do any work on the 7th day. However, that is linked to the other 6 days to show that there's an Isser Malacha, not quite as severe, because it doesn't say Atzeres, but there is an Isser Malacha of sorts on the other 6 days. Now, it doesn't say which of the 6 days, and that, the Gemara says, is up to the Chachamim, up to the Chachamim to decide which of the 6 days are Chol Hamoed and which are Yom Tov. Okay, this concludes the Gemara's discussion about Chol Hamoed. Now the Gemara just briefly refers back to our Mishnah, where we had said that when Shavuos falls on a Shabbos, and therefore you're going to bring all the Karbanos on a Sunday, you're allowed to do Hespedim, you're allowed to do eulogies and other things which you usually don't do on a special Yom Tov day. You're allowed to do them on the day that follows. You're allowed to do them on the Sunday, which is the day where you're going to bring the makeup karbanos. Now, this is according to the opinions that if it's Shabbos, then it's according to everyone, but you can't bring karbanos on that Shabbos. You have to bring it the next day on Sunday. Therefore, as a makeup day, you're bringing karbanos on Sunday, but you're allowed to do Hespedim there. And the reason is because we want to show that it's not a Yom Tov, it's just a makeup day. And the reason we want to clearly show that is because the Tzedukim held that they falsely had the false opinion that Shavuos had to come out on a Sunday every year because it says Memachas Shabbos, that it's the day after Shabbos. We want to make sure that that's clear, that that's not what's happening, and therefore we specifically did Hespedim on that Sunday when we were bringing karbanos as a makeup for Shavuos, which was on a Shabbos. So Gemara asks if this can't be true because there's an incident that happened where Al-Kisa passed away in Lud, and all of Yisrael came to say Hespedim. Rabbi Tarfon said you're not allowed to because it's the Yom Tov of Atzeres, it's Shavuos. So the Gemara says it couldn't have been actual Shavuos, so you wouldn't have Klal Yisrael coming to say Hespedim. They know you can't do Hespedim on a Yom Tov. It must have been that it's the makeup day for Shavuos. It's the day after Shavuos where you make up the karbanos that you missed the day before, and probably you making them up because it was Shabbos, and now it's Sunday, and you see Rav Tarfon told him not to do Hespedim. So Gemara answers, and says, no, we're not talking about where it was a Shabbos, it was really during the week. You missed the karbanos for whatever reason, you missed the karbanos. It still counts as a makeup day if you accidentally missed those karbanos. It's nothing to do with the fact that it's a makeup day for Shabbos, because it wasn't Shabbos. And that's the reason that they were not allowed to do Hespedim. The only heter, the only reason to do Hespedim on the makeup day of karbanos is if it's a Sunday, to show that the Tzedukim are wrong. We now begin our next Mishnah, which departs from the halachos of Yom Tov altogether and goes into the halachos of Tumah and Tahara. It's brought here because at the end it'll mention halachos of Tumah as they apply to a Yom Tov to Haaretz. So we need an introduction to the halachos of Tumah. The halachos of Tumah, and primarily we'll be focusing here on Tumah D'Rabbanan, come in levels. The object which is a source of Tumah itself is called an Av HaTumah. something that becomes tamei by touching that is called a rishon l'tama. It is a first level down of tama. What touches that is a sheni l'tama, a second. What touches that is a third level, and then it goes all the way to fourth and to fifth. The tuma gets weaker and weaker as it goes from level to level. Most of these are going to be tuma d'Rabbanan, tuma d'Oraisa. We don't really have many of these levels, but it goes down from level to level to level. It gets weaker and weaker. Now, the susceptibility of objects to tuma depends on their level of kedusha. Something which has zero kedusha is not too susceptible to tuma. As a matter of fact, it's only susceptible to the higher levels of tuma, like an av hatuma, possibly a rishon or a sheni, as the halachos apply to each one. However, when you have higher levels of kedusha, it can be susceptible to more levels of tuma and can be impacted by even a sheni l'tuma or a shlishi l'tuma or a revi l'tuma. This Mishnah discusses the levels of kedusha and the levels of halacha that apply to each of them in halachos tuma. So the Mishnah will go through the levels, and it'll tell you a number of different areas in which they have differing halachos. They have increasing stringencies based on their level of kedusha. So the items which we'll be discussing here are chulin. That's regular food. The Gemara will divide it up into fruits and bread, but it's regular food that has no kedusha. That is the lowest level kedusha and the lowest level of susceptibility to tuma. It can only become tamei by the highest levels of tuma. That's chulin. Next level up from that is meiser. That's meiser sheni. That's brought to Yerushalayim and eaten there. Next level up from that is truma. That's given to kohanim. Up from that is karbonos, which the Mishnah calls kodesh. And up from that is paraduma water, which is the highest level that we're speaking about. So, and how are these various different things have different levels of kedusha and more stricter halachos as we go up the ladder? So the Mishnah brings 3 examples. Example number 1 is somebody who becomes tamei with a tuma d'Rabbanan, that the Chachamim made gzeira that one's hands become tamei. There's various levels of tuma that the Rabbanan created. Some of them apply only to the hands. So how do you get that tuma off? So as you go up the ladder, you need more to get the tuma off. So if somebody wants to get a tuma off in order to be able to touch chulin, now chulin has no kedusha, but there were people who kept the halachos of tuma even on chulin. That's why you would want to be tahar for chulin. So in order to get that off, you just have to wash your hands until yadayim from a kli. For meiser and truma, also it's the same halacha, even though they're higher levels. For tuma d'Rabbanan, that's only on the hands. You just have to wash the hands to get them off. Now, for karbanos, you do have to put your hands in a mikvah. Again, it's just hands, but it has to actually go into a mikvah. It's 40 sa. In order to be able to touch paraduma water for chatas, then the entire body is considered a tamei, even if it's just the tuma d'Rabbanan, which usually applies only to the hands, and that person has to go into the entire mikvah in order to be able to touch paraduma. Now, the next area in which these levels have differing halacha is simply if one does tefillah, he has to have in mind what he wants the tefillah to work for. And if he has in mind for a lower level, it doesn't work for a higher level. If he has in mind for a higher level, it does work for a lower level. So the Mishnah spells it out. If he did tefillah in order to be able to touch chulin, he is allowed to touch chulin, but he can't touch meiser. If he did tefillah for meiser, he can touch meiser, but he can't touch truma. If he did tefillah for truma, he can touch truma, but he can't touch kodesh, can't touch karbanos. If he did tefillah for karbanos, he can touch karbanos, he can eat karbanos, but he cannot touch paraduma water. If he did tefillah just to wash his hands, or he did netila just to wash his hands, he wasn't planning on anything at all, then it doesn't work for anything. Doesn't count as a tefillah, and he has to do it over again. Now, the next area in which the Mishnah discusses is if somebody is keeping himself tahar for the halachas that apply to him, he's assumed to have done a good job, and he's tahar for those halachas. He's not tahar, though, for a higher level. So therefore, an Amma Aretz, who's not interested in any tahara halachas at all, even if he doesn't know that he's tamei in any way, we have to assume that he's tamei and his clothing are tamei, and therefore somebody who keeps the halachos of tuma on chulin, which the Gemara call prushin, those are tamei chachamim, and they keep halachos of tuma even on chulin, they have to assume that the clothing of the Amma Aretz are tamei. Rashi explains that his wife may have sat on them while she was in nida, and that makes them tamei tumas medris. It's that an object or clothing upon which a nida sat or lay. Now, that's for an Am Aretz who doesn't keep any tumah at all. So they are tamei even for somebody who just wants to keep the halachos of tumah as far as chulin goes. Now, somebody who keeps the halachos for chulin, but he's not a kohen, so he doesn't need truma, so he's okay. His clothing are considered clean if he doesn't know of any tumah as far as chulin goes, but not for truma. You have to consider his clothing to be tamei even for truma. Now, a kohen who keeps truma but doesn't eat karbanos, you have to assume his clothing are tamei for karbanos, and the same thing would apply higher. Now the Mishnah ends off with two examples of this. The Mishnah says that Yosef ben Yoezer was a chassid of the Kohanim. He was a high tzaddik of the Kohanim, but he didn't need karbanos, and therefore his clothing would be considered tamei medris for karbanos. As far as karbanos are concerned, even though we don't know of any tamah, we would consider them to be tamei. Now Yochanan ben Gudgada, he would eat everything al taros hakodesh. He kept the halachos of karbanos for everything, because he held himself to that level. But still, if he wanted to touch parduma water, would have to consider his clothing to be tamei, and he could not assume that they stayed a tahar for those purposes as well. We now begin the Gemara, and the Gemara immediately has two contradictions against this brisa. And that is it true that you have to wash your hands for chulin and meiser? We have a brisa clearly says one does not have to wash his hands in order to eat chulin and meiser. Tumah d'Rabbanan is not a problem for chulin and meiser. The brisa says as follows. It talks about truma and bikurim. It says the following halachos apply to truma and bikurim. It's forbidden for a non-kohen to eat them. If he eats them, he's chayav misa, and he has to pay chomesh. He has to pay a fifth of the value if he eats it by accident. They belong to the kohen; they're his property. He can use it to be mekadesh a woman. And if they get mixed into chulin, then they are only batel in 100 times as much. And they require one's hands to be washed before eating them. It doesn't say before what, it just says it requires one's hands to be washed. One who has gone to the mikvah cannot touch them, cannot handle them, or eat them until he has sunset. He needs herav shemesh. He's what's called a tful yom. Now, the Brisa says clearly this applies to truma and bikurim, does not apply to chulin and meiser. So you see clearly, chulin and meiser one does not have to wash his hands for. So the Gemara has to resolve each one separately. Chulin against chulin and meiser against meiser. So the Gemara first wants to say, meiser against meiser is not a kasha. It's a machlokas Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. It's a machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim whether one has to wash his hands for chulin and meiser or not. The Gemara quotes a Mishnah that shows that. It says anything which requires to go into water, midrabanan. That means anything which is mitame the hands, midrabanan. So that is mitame things which are kodesh, and it passos things that are truma. Now that means as follows: to be mitame means that it is tamei, and it is tamei enough to make something else tamei. To be pasul, that means that it is tamei, but it cannot make another level of tuma. Now, something which has tumah d'Rabbanan is considered a sheni. So it can make a kodesh tamei because a kodesh is susceptible to third level tuma. It would be third level, and a kodesh is also susceptible to fourth level. So that third level can make a fourth level in kodesh. However, truma could be third level. Truma is one level less severe. Truma could be third level, cannot be fourth level, and therefore it can only make it possible, but it cannot be matama anything else. Now, that Mishnah ends off, and it says that this is all true as far as truma and kodesh. What's the halacha for chulin and meiser? So it says meiser is a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. Rabbi Meir says that meiser is not a problem. Meiser does not require any tefillah or anything. The Chachamim say you have to do tefillah or netilah for meiser as well. Chulin, there's no machlokes. Chulin is mutter. Chulin, everybody agrees you don't have to do tefillah. So therefore, the answer to our steer is that it's a machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, and the brisa that says that tefillah is not required, that is Rabbi Meir, and the Mishnah that says that tefillah is required, that's a Chachamim. The problem is going to be chulin against chulin. We have a contradiction as far as chulin goes, whether you have to wash hands for chulin or not. So the Gemara wants to say, not a kasha, one is talking about touching chulin, one is talking about eating chulin. You only have to wash your hands to eat chulin, not to touch chulin. The Gemara says this can't be correct because we have a statement, it's a brisa that shows that Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim actually argue about eating meiser. Touching meiser is no machlokes, and eating chulin is no machlokes. Eating of meiser, that's where there is a machlokes. So we cannot differentiate in chulin between touching and eating. There is no difference between touching and eating in chulin. So Gemara therefore says I have to give a different answer. We're talking about eating. Both the Mishnah and the Brisa are discussing eating. One's talking about eating bread, one's talking about eating fruits. You only have to wash for chulin bread. You don't have to wash for chulin fruits. The Gemara quotes a support for that. Nachman says anybody washes his hands for fruits is a Baal Gaiva. He's from the Gaise Hiruach. Okay, now the different subject, the Gemara quotes a Brisa that says somebody who washes his hands only counts as washing if he did it b'kavana, if he intended to be mitahir his hands. Now, tevilas yadayim, he puts his hands in the mikvah, so this Brisa also says he also has to have kavana. The Gemara says, but there's a different Brisa that says as far as tefillah goes, you don't have to have kavana. So it's a steer between Brisas that you have to have kavana for tevilas yadayim to work. So Nachman answers, one's talking about chulin, one is talking about meiser. For chulin, you don't have to have kavana, for meiser, you do.